Hi, my name is Michael O'Rourke. I am professor in the philosophy department at Michigan State University and also a faculty member in Ag Bioresearch at a unit that focuses on research extension in the state of Michigan. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to stand up in front of you and lead a workshop today on an approach that collaborators of mine and I have developed over the last decade. I want to begin by thanking Gabrielle for the opportunity to do this. It's a really wonderful opportunity for the Toolbox Project, and I'm really looking forward to getting feedback from you folks about the approach that we've developed. One of the things that I'll say before I kind of launch into the slides is that we make a distinction in our project between introductory workshops and full workshops. Introductory workshops are designed to introduce people to the approach, and so they're kind of like teasers or trailers or something for the Toolbox approach, not really full-blown workshops, and that's what we'll do today. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to, especially given the size of this, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and lead everyone through a full workshop. So that's the goal. And here is an outline of the workshop as a whole. I'll give you a little bit of a sense of the plan, so how the time will be structured for the next 90 minutes or so. And then I'll launch into a preamble. And the thing that I'd like to do initially is talk a bit about the problem. What's the problem that we're trying to address with the approach that I'm going to be talking about today? And once I've hopefully describe the problem to your satisfaction, I'll talk a little bit about the leading idea that's motivated our response to that problem. And then I'll give you a bit of the history of the project, the Toolbox Project. And finally, I'll close with some nuts and bolts about the workshop itself. So here's the plan. I'll talk at you for 30 minutes or so. And then at that point, I would like all of you to take a handout that you will be given over the course of the next half hour and fill it out. So this is the Toolbox instrument, which you'll have in your hand. Folks online, if you're participating in this, I think you'll be able to find the handout online. So be sure to take a look at it there. 30 minutes after you've scored the instrument or completed the instrument, you'll dialogue about it in groups. So I'm going to have you break up into groups of 10 or so and talk about a few of the statements that are included in the instrument. And then after a half hour, we'll gather together again as a full group, and I'll take questions, and we can have a kind of debrief discussion amongst ourselves about the experience. I'd very much like to get your feedback on this. I mean, this is a gathering of experts unlike any I've been in front of before, and certainly unlike any that has worked their way through this approach. So I'm very excited about the debrief part of the workshop. Okay, with that, I'll begin again by identifying the problem. What is the problem that we're attempting to address? Now, this group does not need a primer in the nature of or importance of complex problems, but I'm going to launch into this just using that. It's a very common way into this problem space, and it's one that I've adopted for today's workshop. Complex problems require complex responses. So we've already seen a variety of complex problems described and discussed in the sessions at this conference. Sustainability, hunger, climate change, and so forth. The posters also do a marvelous job of demonstrating how this community has dealt in a variety of different ways with complex problems of that type. The complex responses are, they can be collaborative, right? They can involve teams of researchers engaged in attempting to address the problems like sustainability. They can be transdisciplinary, where you have, as Christian talked about this morning, you can have researchers on the, but also stakeholders and others on the society side working together in tandem to figure out ways of addressing complex problems in a sustainable fashion. So the complex responses are themselves complex in a wide variety of different ways. This is a theme that's sounded by the National Academies of Science in the U.S. Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research report, which Julie talked about yesterday morning. They tell us that interdisciplinary thinking is rapidly becoming an integral feature of research as a result of 4 powerful drivers. You have the inherent complexity of nature and society, the desire to explore problems and questions that are not confined to a single discipline, the need to solve societal problems, and the power of new technologies. It's worth noting that these 4 are not unrelated, right? It's not just a list of disconnected drivers. No, the inherent complexity of nature and society kicks up problems that are bound to be multidisciplinary at least, right? They're bound to have a footprint in a number of different epistemic communities, epistemic cultures. And many of those problems are going to be problems that afflict societies. And technologies offer us a very powerful way of addressing those problems and bringing to bear multiple disciplinary perspectives in our response to those problems. Once again, this is a slide that's old news to most everyone in the room, but interdisciplinary activity requires a number of skills and commitments on the part of its practitioners. Mastery of multiple literatures. This is a very frustrating aspect of interdisciplinary activity, at least from my perspective. I read very slowly, so the fact that I'm regularly exposed to literatures that bear on what I'm doing, but I've not read anything in, is kind of it's a downer, big time. But it is just a fact of life for folks who are engaged in interdisciplinary activity. An aspect of this type of work that I think is perhaps a bit underappreciated is the importance of identifying integrative research problems. It's not difficult to identify complex problems of great societal consequence. Hunger, poverty, climate change. Nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but many people agree that these are extremely complex problems that require response. But it's one thing to identify problems at that level of abstraction, another thing to identify problems at a researchable level, right? So figure out how to kind of reduce the grain size of those problems so that you can get a grip on them as investigators. That's tricky, and it's not by any means a kind of formulaic process, right? It's going to vary depending upon who you're working with, the time constraints, funding constraints, and so forth. Ability to synthesize different methods. This is something that I suspect many of us are familiar with, right? Qualitative and quantitative methods or conceptual methods. People bring to bear different ways of operating. That's one of the great advantages of working in interdisciplinary groups, is that you have so many different approaches that are available to you. Challenge, though, of course, is to figure out some way to speak in one voice about the problems that you're addressing. Finally, the integration of results to the appropriate degree. One thing that, at least in my view, it's important to emphasize, and that is that it's easy to get kind of sucked into a certain way of thinking about integration, right? Where the more integration, the better. And it's not always the case, in my view at least, that's true. I think that depending upon, once again, the context within which you're operating, it may very well be necessary to aim at a less integrated, more multidisciplinary response than a more integrated interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary response. Right? You have to operate in a way that reflects the constraints that are impinging upon you as a researcher, and you need to, if results require quick action, and quick action is conducive only to multidisciplinary integration, then that's what you should aim for. And when interdisciplinary activity doesn't have to be collaborative, right? You can do this on your own. But when it is collaborative, what you find are problems that are akin to problems that arise in multicultural situations. So think about strangers, interdisciplinary collaborative activity is involving strangers from foreign lands, right? People who have become comfortable, become residents really, of social and epistemic cultures. Different cultures that have different conventions and different rules, different histories. Folks involved in an interdisciplinary project bring with them those histories as a critical part of their identity. And in order for most of these projects to be successful, those folks have to figure out how to speak in a single voice. And for a couple of reasons. One, there's just the merely pragmatic reason of being able to talk to your students and to administrators and funders and others who are patrons of your work. If you're unable to speak in a single voice to your students, you lose students. Right? If you can't talk to administrators about your work in a single voice, then administrators start to wonder what the heck you're doing. Further, if you want to write successful grant proposals and write manuscripts that are published, you need to be able to speak in a single voice. One way to think about interdisciplinary activity, it seems to me, is a kind of multidimensional localization. So localization is a sort of phenomenon or a concept really that's home to in translation, professional translation contexts. And there the focus is on making the foreign familiar. Right? So when you localize something, you make the foreign familiar, and that really is the challenge that confronts you if you engage in interdisciplinary activity. Making what amounts to foreign epistemic perspectives on the problem that interests you familiar enough to you that you can work with it. Now, this kind of activity, right? Activity that involves blending together multiple social and epistemic cultures is challenging on a whole bunch of different fronts. Here's a list, by no means comprehensive, of the challenges that confront you if you're going to engage in this type of work. It'd be great if I could stand up here and say that the project the Toolbox Project, the project that I direct, is out to solve every single one of these, but that's just not true. Right? There are way too many problems that are difficult and complex and operate according to their own logic out there that go well beyond our ability to deal with them. We have, though, kind of bitten off a rather sizable challenge, and that is the communication challenge. So what disciplinary, so here's a quote from Turner. This is in the Practicing Interdisciplinarity volume. That I think really kind of puts it in a nutshell. Right? That what disciplinary training serves to do is create a community of persons who can understand what is said. And so when you acquire your disciplinary credential, you are exposed to literatures and practices that put you in a position to talk the talk and eventually walk the walk associated with your discipline. Right? And that's part and parcel of becoming a fully credentialed member of that disciplinary community. But once again, right, the fact that this is part of what it is, part of what's involved in becoming an expert of your specific type, it creates a fundamental challenge for folks who are interested in crossing disciplinary boundaries. This is something, again, that the National Academies of Science saw very clearly. The quote there, I think, does a nice job of positioning communication as a central challenge for those of us who are interested in participating in interdisciplinary activity. Okay, so just to kind of step back for a second and summarize where we're at. So the problem that we're interested in, ultimately, is this problem of trying to make sense out of how to solve or at least address complex problems of great social consequence. And those problems will require complex responses. Those complex responses will, and in many cases, motivate interdisciplinary activity, which can often be collaborative. And when it is collaborative, you've got a variety of challenges, principal among them, the challenge of being able to communicate with one another across disciplinary boundaries. So that's sort of the problem space that I want to position us in for the workshop. Here's a bit of additional analysis of the communication challenge as we understand it. So again, return to the idea of disciplines as knowledge cultures. Here I'm focusing on the epistemic side more than the social side of disciplinary culture. One way to understand how disciplines operate as knowledge cultures is to kind of recognize that when you operate within a discipline, when you tackle disciplinary problems, what you're doing is you're isolating aspects of interest. So aspects of the world, phenomena, whatever, that interest you. You're isolating those, foregrounding them, backgrounding everything else pretty much. And then you're bringing to bear on those problems the suite of methods that you've acquired facility with in the course of your training. Right? So you're an expert. You're able to wield these methods and generate results as a consequence. You do so relative to the problems that have caught your eye. In the course of becoming a disciplinary expert, you are trained to see those problems and the relevance of your methods to those problems. And so, members of knowledge culture share assumptions about how one should investigate these topics of interest. Again, those assumptions are a part of the sort of the tacit provenance of the disciplines. These are things that you come to acquire in the course of your training. Right? And as a consequence, because they're tacit, they frame your way of seeing the world and do so in a fashion that is often invisible to you. And it's often difficult to recognize that the world appears problematic in the way that it does to you, largely because of the way you've been trained to see the world. And others have been trained to see it differently. So the problems that matter to you may not matter to them. In the course of becoming a disciplinary, a kind of resident of one of these disciplinary cultures, then you acquire a worldview, a research worldview, that enables you to speak a certain language, think certain thoughts, and perform certain actions. So interdisciplinary activity, then, to summarize, is a kind of multicultural integration in which much can be lost in translation. What we're trying to do with the Toolbox Project is respond to that challenge, so conceived. Right? We're focusing on understanding and improving communication about research content within cross-disciplinary research. As you'll see, the history of the project and much of the work that we've done focuses on collaborating teams. Obviously, today we don't have collaborating teams, but we've done a fair amount of work using this approach with non-collaborating teams and non-collaborating groups of individuals, and there's reason to believe that in those contexts as well, this approach has some merit. The goal of the Toolbox Project is to enhance communication and increase collaborative capacity by reducing the amount that is lost in translation. Okay, that's the way in. Now, how do we do this? The leading idea is a really simple one, and it's not rocket science, really. I mean, we want to help people communicate better across disciplinary boundaries. So one way of creating the ability to communicate more effectively is to enhance mutual understanding. So if you enhance mutual understanding, it's not a given that people will communicate better, obviously. But it does create at least some capacity for communicative improvements. Philosophy is what we use for the purpose of doing this. What we are out to do is exploit a couple of different aspects of philosophy for the purposes of enhancing communication. The first would be the content or the concepts of philosophy. Philosophy has been kind of engaged for more than a couple of millennia in trying to make sense out of how it is people investigate the world, how it is people seek to understand how the world operates. In other words, what it provides us with is a set of concepts that we can use to systematically frame the assumptions that form a part of the scientific engagement with the world. So the philosophical concepts have value for us. So too the methods of philosophy. Philosophy operates in an abstracting mode. What you typically do when you do philosophy is you abstract away from concrete difference toward more general regularities. That particular type of movement is a movement that can help collaborators find common ground. So when they're kind of deep in the weeds doing work on their problems, they might encounter a number of different obstacles. And what philosophy can help you do, if you're kind of in that situation, is abstract toward common ground you share with your collaborators as scientists. We see the approach that we've developed as an approach that generates learning. And so we have learning objectives associated with it, collaborative learning objectives. The Toolbox approach, as you'll see, is a kind of dialogue method. What we're doing is using philosophy to structure a dialogue among collaborators, or a dialogue among interested participants. The dialogue is intended to facilitate knowledge synthesis and improve decision making. Right? So it is an example of a particular kind of dialogue method, and it focuses on collaborative learning. The objectives can be understood in terms of habits. So again, focusing on the tacit sort of provenance of disciplinary training, the things you learn when you become a disciplinary expert. It would be good when you're working with collaborators to be able to articulate what those habits are. What are your research habits? So one goal is to enable people to identify them and articulate them for their collaborators, and in so doing share those habits with their collaborators. And in dialogue, if necessary, there can be a further work toward coordination of those habits. This is a slide that I'm not sure everybody can read, but it's a slide that provides a bit of evidence of impact. We collect data from the workshops that we run, and we've run about 110 around the world at this point. And these data are derived from post-workshop questionnaires that we distribute to the participants. There are a variety of other data that we collect as well, and we analyze for purposes of assessing impact and improving the approach. What these at least give sort of us reason to believe is that the participants who engage in these workshops derive some benefit from them. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that slide just one last time. So there's one particular line here that I want to call attention to, and this is the 1/3 from the bottom. Workshop had or could have a positive impact on research communication. The number there isn't as high as perhaps we'd like to see it be, given the goal of increasing or enhancing communication. So, again, one of the things that we're interested in doing in this project, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited about having the opportunity to run the workshop here today, is enhance and improve our approach as well. So take advantage of integration and implementation science experts like you, and in the process, hopefully, come away with some insight that will assist us in improving what we're doing. Talk a little bit about the history of this. So it's again a project that I like to think of it as a project in philosophical intervention that aims to enhance communication among cross-disciplinary collaborators. It derives from an integrative graduate education and research traineeship project, an IGRT project, which is a U.S. National Science Foundation program. This particular program had a project at the University of Idaho where I was formerly employed. And this particular project was quite interesting. It admitted graduate students into the program, and in that program they were teamed up from the beginning, and then they had to work together in teams for the duration of their PhD experience. They identified an overarching research problem and then wrote dissertations on aspects of that problem. Those dissertations had to be integrated in the following way. They had to write one chapter, at least, that would appear in all of those dissertations. So they'd co-author a chapter that would appear in all the dissertations, and that chapter had to be published. So integration was a critical part of the experience for those students. And, in fact, they were unable to complete their PhDs as members of that program without succeeding in writing such a chapter. So really, it's a high bar, I think. And, some of them struggled a bit to achieve that. Right? I mean, the program did a wonderful job of providing capacity and resources for achieving it. In fact, cleared as many of the obstacles as you could clear. But because it's so challenging, the students still had questions and issues. A few of the students recognized that philosophy might be helpful. They identified as one of the maybe more fundamental challenges the fact that their collaborators had different philosophical orientations. And so they thought a seminar devoted to the philosophy of interdisciplinary research might help. I was invited to team teach that. It led to a publication in Bioscience and subsequent funding by NSF and other sources. We've also developed what we do by partnering with groups. We've partnered recently with a number of climate change research initiatives and also health science initiatives in the U.S. And as I indicated, over 110 workshops, on 3 continents and a number of publications. And we recently brought out a book with Sage that includes a chapter by Gabrielle. It talks about integration and implementation science. This is a volume that focuses on enhancing communication and collaboration in interdisciplinary research. How can this help you? Given that you're not a collaborating team, you're not like one of these graduate student teams. Well, today it really isn't about enhancing your ability to do interdisciplinary research with your collaborators. It's more about introducing you to this particular dialogue method and giving you the opportunity to experience what it's like. So at this point, you should all have the handout, the Toolbox instrument, and that is going to be the foundation of much of what we do from here on out. Normally, as I indicated, what we do when we run a workshop is we collect data. So it typically involves treating workshop participants as human subjects. For that work, we have institutional review board approval. That's not what we're going to do today. No, when we're not collecting data today, I just wanted to kind of let you know that this is how we operate normally. In the event that anyone is interested in running a workshop like this with our involvement, then this would become relevant. But it's not relevant today since we're not collecting any data. There are 2 moving parts of the workshop, and the first is the instrument. So we call this the Toolbox, and it's a structured set of philosophical prompts that's meant to represent the epistemological and metaphysical dimensions of collaborative science. Okay, you might wonder why we call it a toolbox. I mean, the real answer is that we couldn't come up with a better name for it. But I think that it's appropriate. We think of each of these statements as a kind of tool, a tool designed to get at assumptions that scientists share as investigators of the world. So we see each of these statements and the core questions as tools. Each of so the instrument itself is divided into 6 what we call modules. Each module has a core question that announces a theme and then probing statements that develop it. There's space for answers to the questions, and there are also Likert scales associated with each of the statements. What we're going to do today is, instead of having you fill the whole thing out, because it takes a little bit of time to do that, I'm going to have you concentrate initially on the confirmation module and the values module. So those are included in here. So start with those. In 10 minutes, if you have an opportunity to fill more of it out, great, go for it. But at least start with those 2 modules. The second moving part is the workshop itself. So the workshop focuses on dialogue. And what we want to do in a full workshop is create a dialogue, again, in which collaborators can learn about one another. So we're interested in staying out of the way as much as possible. We don't impose an order on the participants, so there's no particular path through the toolbox. They get to choose that on their own based on their interests. We don't direct them, so that the facilitation approach is quite light-handed. And furthermore, we don't define terms. So this doesn't come with a glossary. And as you read it, you'll undoubtedly identify statements that include vague terms or ambiguous terms or extreme terms. That, in all likelihood, will frustrate some of you. And you might want those terms to be defined in order for you to answer these statements, to respond to these statements. But what we've done, we've sort of made a project decision not to do that, in part because smart people like you, if given definitions for terms, will use the terms according to those definitions for as long as we ask you to, even if those definitions don't come close to, kind of getting at the concepts as you understand them. So that would, in effect, make the dialogue more about us than about you, and that's not our interest. So the goal is to put you in a position to kind of negotiate with your dialogue partners understandings of those concepts. We ask that you adopt a single perspective when you fill this out, or if you adopt more than one perspective, just keep track of them. Maybe annotate the toolbox as you fill it out. People here are engaged in all sorts of interdisciplinary activities, so there are multiple perspectives you could adopt. Just keep track of that, because that's going to shape how you contribute to the dialogue. Typically ends with a second instrument and a debrief. We're going to dispense with the second instrument today and just focus on the debrief once the time comes. All right, and now, so here's what I'd like you to do. This room is really not set up for this, and let alone folks online. All right, but what I'd like you to do is identify a group of about 10 people, more or less, and find find some place to hang out. It could be outside. You don't have to stay in here. You can go outside if you want. And then once you've identified your group, fill out the confirmation and values modules, and if more than that, if you have more time, then fill out more modules. And then at 10 minutes, I'm going to ring the bell if the bell is around somewhere, and then ask that at that point you start talking about the statements. So again, the point of the dialogue is to talk about the statements, talk about what the statements mean to you, how those statements get at your approach as an investigator. And in those dialogues, it would be a really good idea if somebody volunteered to be a facilitator. So this is somebody who's just kind of agreeing to spur the dialogue on should it lag. But I do encourage everybody to take responsibility for the dialogue since it's yours. And I'll make the rounds and just see if anybody has any questions as you're working on this. And we'll reconvene in about 40 minutes or so, I think, and have some debrief Q&A. All right? For those of you who are online, I'm going to spend the last 15 minutes of this 40 minutes answering questions. So if you have questions or comments about this, please enter them, and then I'll respond to them in that 15-minute period. All right. So are there any questions at this point before we get started? Oh yeah, good, thank you. Two things. One, you'll notice at the end of every module there is a team-focused statement, and there are a few other team-focused statements along the way. You can pretty much just ignore those, or if you want to, you could sort of take a guess about the group that you find yourself in. But again, those statements are really aimed at the collaborating teams and not at ad hoc groups like this. Thank you. I'm sorry. Oh, your answers personally. Yeah, your answers personally. What's that? Oh, right, yeah. So the question was, should the perspective be the group's perspective or the individual's perspective in responding to the statements, and it should be the individual's perspective. Off and running, thank you. All right, I just wanted to let folks know online that if you have questions or concerns or comments about the instrument, you're welcome to send them in or put them on the Twitter page, and I'm happy to respond to those. I'd like to make sure that everybody online who has something to say is able to say it and get a response. So I'll be sort of hovering over the computer here for the next 15 minutes, and if there's anything you have to say it, and I'll see what I can come up with in response. Thanks. The question is, how does group size influence the utility and effectiveness of the toolbox? Well, today we're working with about 60 people, which is way too many for the approach as we've designed it. So our sense of what works best with these dialogue-based workshops is to have groups in the 8 to 12 person range. I think a lot of it depends upon the extent to which the people involved in the workshop know one another well and have already established a kind of effective or efficient communicative dynamic. So larger groups that have had some experience with one another, perhaps in a dialogue type setting, tend to be pretty proficient at accomplishing things in dialogue over the space of 90 minutes to 2 hours. But just like in classes, right? You expect that larger classes will have a kind of stultifying effect on discussion, and only the folks who really have a lot to say or aren't afraid of standing out in big groups will do most of the talking, and that's certainly been borne out by our experience with these workshops. The smallest group that we've worked with is a three-person group, and that went pretty well. There's a significant amount of pressure on each individual in a very small group to talk, and so it's nice to have a little bit of size because that allows people to take a little bit of time off, but not too much size and it's easy to disappear. And I think that at least for the purposes of the the workshop, if the goal is to generate mutual understanding, it's better if the mutual understanding is truly mutual and involves everyone, or at least most everyone, and not just 2 or 3 people who are doing most of the talking. Thank you for the question. A second follow-up question from Jan. The question is, if groups repeat the toolbox, what additional benefits do they report to you and your team? Repeated use of the toolbox, we haven't done this as much as we would like. The sort of longitudinal assessment of the approach is something that remains in prospect for us. We have conducted toolbox workshops with groups in sequence, where we conducted one, and then maybe a year, 6 months to a year later, we conduct another with probably about 5 to 6 groups. Most of those groups have expressed a kind of interest in the depth to which they were able to, the depth they were able to attain in dialogue the second time around. This is true especially of graduate student groups. I think graduate student groups tend to be, they're acquiring facility with their science along the way, and so they just become more proficient scientists and more confident scientists, and that confidence is exhibited in the context of the subsequent workshops. It's hard to tease out exactly what the different impact of the toolbox approach, or the toolbox dialogue is, but we have noticed that in cases where we've conducted subsequent workshops with students, that those subsequent workshops have been kind of conducted at a deeper level conceptually. One of the things that we've begun doing is working with teams to modify the instrument so as to use it in prompting dialogue about matters that are of a special interest to that group the second time around. So don't just use the same instrument again, but instead modify the instrument slightly, perhaps solicit statements from those groups, so that in the context of an overall dialogue about scientific assumptions, they can focus in on some of the issues that they've realized have become issues for them, but perhaps aren't directly or explicitly addressed in the instrument as we've written it. This is, from the perspective, I guess, of experimental design and assessing the impact of the instrument, this is problematic, but from the perspective of having the biggest impact that we can have on the process that team is engaged in, we think that there's good reason to continue that, at least giving people the opportunity to use the instrument in that way. Thank you. Okay, I think I'm going to go gather everyone together, and we'll spend the last 15 minutes or so in Q&A. Does that sound okay? Sure, yeah, absolutely. And feel free to answer them. I think we'll go ahead and close the workshop with Q&A, or normally we would structure the debrief part of the workshop by asking folks what worked for them, what didn't work for them, what changes they'd recommend. Another question that's often asked in debrief is what particular issues, assumptions have you identified in the course of your work that are not represented, at least indirectly, in the context of this particular instrument. But I think that it might be better for the purposes of the workshop today, given this introductory character, to just have it be an open Q&A. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts or comments or questions about what we're trying to do with this.
Just one observation, that when we were doing the group discussion, we were finding a lot of us were sort of in the same area, which was great. And it was, oh yeah, say number 4, 5, It would have been good to have been actually then talking a bit more about, well, why are we in the same grouping, and would there be circumstances when we might be different, or how would we deal with that difference? I mean, we had a really, really good discussion about that, but I'm just thinking as a workshop it might help to unpick that a bit more, because for myself, I've gone from being a biological scientist and I'm becoming more of a social scientist. So, you know, it could be that we're in the same spot because we are ourselves practising in the area of interdisciplinary research. So it's a different finding, I suppose, yeah, that's just my observation. I just think there's something in that which I think is quite interesting, which we didn't really get to talk more about, and I think it's worth exploring.
Need a little help. Maybe just repeat that, the business end of that question.
Yeah, sorry. I think the fact that we're all clumped in the same area, I think that's an area worth exploring a bit more, because I think that might inadvertently reflect that we ourselves are becoming or are interdisciplinary researchers. Whereas if we had this breadth of, we're at two different ends as a group, as a team, it's showing that maybe we haven't done that journey. But I don't know. It's just a reflection. Embarrassed to say that I'm losing my hearing, and it makes it a little difficult for me to pick up some of the questions. I apologize for that.
Hi, I'm Karen Astles from New South Wales Fisheries. With that question on confirmation, I'm just wondering the core question, whether it needs to go around the other way in the terms of what types of knowledge or knowledges are required for evidentiary support. And the reason why I'm saying it that way is the kind of context that I'm sort of working at the moment is with multiple stakeholder groups,
right.
And there's this tussle going on about whether certain knowledges are more valid or more or less valid than other types of knowledge to support an argument.
Okay. Yeah. Eric, could you? Yeah. I'm sorry.
What sorts of knowledge are more or less valid to support an argument? That's one of the debates.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the types of knowledges are, this is an aspect of these dialogues that we, at least in many of the workshops, haven't encountered. So this is, again, an unusual collection of participants in these workshops from the perspective of the Toolbox workshop history. I think that you represent a significant amount of kind of collective understanding about the range of different epistemologies, the range of different ways in which people can know about the world. Often in the workshops that we've conducted, that range is pretty limited. So you have groups that are kind of committed to trying to figure out collectively how to go forward as a group, right? And they all, I mean, they may have a significant amount of disciplinary breadth in the sense that they represent a wide range of different disciplines, but it's been pretty much typically the case that they have sort of epistemic orientations that enable them to communicate with one another, right? Even if you have sort of positivist scientists and post-positivist social scientists, there's still enough overlap in training and understanding that they can communicate with one another. And again, so long as you have a kind of antecedent commitment to a collective objective, then those differences are differences that they're willing to negotiate and work through. One of the things that we've begun doing, as I indicated in the initial in my initial remarks, is that we've begun working with groups that operate that focus on climate change research, and also groups that focus on health science research. Both of those contexts are contexts that are more transdisciplinary. So all of our partners in those two contexts are partners that are interested in translating research results into communities in a sustainable way. And they've for the most part, arranged research processes that are kind of bidirectional in the sense that the stakeholders and others who are sort of the non-researchers of the group nevertheless do have input into the research process and structure. And so there's an attempt on the part of all of those groups pretty much to involve people outside of the research community in the design and delivery of research, scientific research. There, in the question of different knowledges becomes much more vexing. And in that context, so this instrument's an instrument that's not going to work very well in that context, bottom line. And we realized this kind of early on by trying to use it in that context and recognizing that there were some significant disconnections between what people were saying and what people were hearing. And so what we've done with most of those partners is work with them to develop instruments that get at assumptions, but get at assumptions in a way that permits articulation and development and dialogue from multiple ways of knowing, so that part of the negotiation process can be a negotiation process that's consistent, I think, with the kind of epistemological pluralism that Zoe was talking about yesterday. Yeah, it's a critically important question from our perspective, and one that we're still struggling with.
Hello, I'm Becky Schmidt from CSIRO in Canberra. Mm-hmm. I can imagine some of your workshops, in answering these questions, there's a lot of conflict. I'm curious if there have been many cases in which groups decide to not work together after going through this because the divide is too great and they disagree too much.
So hold it. So the groups, how many groups have done this and then not worked well together afterwards?
Or decided not to work because this identifies that they're so far apart that they never will be able to work together.
There's no, at this point, there's no evidence of that result having happened. Of the dialogue revealing deep differences so deep that the group decides collectively to disband, or right. So we know of no projects that have disbanded as a consequence of the Toolbox dialogue. But it's certainly, I mean, it's certainly the kind of consequence that's at least possible, and it's in fact something that we've been asked about before, right? I mean, because I describe what we do as a philosophical intervention. And that was a term that was used by a referee on the early paper. And to some extent, I think it does reflect kind of how we operate. We step into a situation that, as outsiders, and attempt to make a difference, a positive difference in the conduct of the science by the insiders. And in doing that, we take on a certain amount of responsibility, including ethical responsibility, for the impact of the dialogue on that group. And so what we've tried to do over the course of the project is develop responsible follow-up activities and responsible sort of follow-up contact with teams to kind of at least enable them to continue working with us, should they decide on the basis of the dialogue that working with us is something that's going to add value to their science, right? But again, you know, we recognize it as a possibility, but so far, I don't think that has happened.
Michael, this is Christian from Switzerland. Here I am.
Oh, hi, Christian.
I use the tool, or several versions of the tool, and my question is basically, why did you go to the Likert scale questions now? And the question goes like that: I use the tool with students, but in a version where there are more like open questions, the early versions, where you kind of think about what counts as evidence in your discipline. And this is a very creative way, I think, of starting a debate, whereas when I now have to place myself in a Likert scale, whether I'm from this or that side, that creates a completely different mindset in my mind. So my question was, why do you go into this Likert scale? I think
You're going to have to help me with this one, too.
So the first version of the questionnaire was open-ended, and now you've gone to a wider scale.
Yeah.
The question wants to know why you've reached that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. I appreciate your patience with me. So for a couple of reasons. One, the first version of the instrument, which was published in the Bioscience article, had questions and it was open-ended. And the dialogues we facilitated with that instrument tended to be, well, kind of frustrating for everyone, in part because what we met with in more than one occasion was the it depends response, which is a perfectly appropriate response, one we don't want to discourage at all. But there was really no motivation provided by the instrument to the participants to, get off the fence. If they were comfortable on the fence, they just stayed there, and the quality of the dialogue deteriorated. Right. So what we're interested in having people do is to talk about what they, what their assumptions are and how their assumptions might structure their scientific responses in particular contexts. So while there might be contextual dependency, what we really want them to do is to sort of identify some contexts and talk about what they would do, what they would do in that context, in those contexts. And what we determined as a group was that the instrument wasn't doing the job of providing people with motivation to have that kind of conversation. So one of the reasons for introducing the Likert scales was to, in effect, just create at least the appearance of difference that would motivate dialogue. Right, so there might, because of the nature of these statements, it's not always the case that differences in Likert response correlate with differences in how they understand the concepts that are introduced by the statements. But that would be something that would then emerge in dialogue. So that'd be something that they would identify in the course of talking about the difference. The second reason is just we initially didn't think of this in terms as a research project. We were really motivated by the desire to make a difference in the lives of those graduate student teams. We didn't have grand visions of running workshops in Australia. That was not something we were thinking about. And so, but it became evident to us that if we were serious about doing this work, that it was important to assess the impact of the work itself and to determine if, in fact, this type of approach to facilitating cross-disciplinary communication made a salutary difference in the lives of the teams that used it. And the Likert scales are part of the, sort of part of the research-focused or research-motivated response that we've pursued.
So it's Susie here, and I facilitated the group that Christian also was involved in. And just to give you a bit of feedback from our group, we had no difficulty in having a great diversity of responses to your tool. Some people responded very dynamically and with a real sense of their identity being challenged, like it was a core kind of inflammatory response, and people thought it was a vexatious kind of tool and used the words weapon even as a description of what it might be. And other people very quickly went to how can it be used and for whom might it be useful. I think that our team felt that they were actually imposed upon by the on epistemological assumption underpinning the tool design, and it sort of presumed a positivist kind of baseline to be departed from, when in many instances as transdisciplinary practitioners that's not an assumption that was helpful in opening up this kind of dialogue. Another point is the core questions were kind of useful rather than the sub-questions, and a third point was that there are cultural assumptions about the nature of knowledge, presuming a kind of a Western philosophical construct. And when you're working cross-culturally, particularly in areas of Indigenous knowledges, those sorts of assumptions are not relevant, and this tool would be useful to be applied in that. So somebody used the language of knowledge ecologies as a way of helping you to think into that.
Okay. What? A range of feedback. Mm-hmm.
Stemming positivist knowledge.
Right.
And that became a confrontation.
Yeah, I think, so the positivist point, here I'm kind of riffing on that. I can't promise you that I'm responding to your comments, but I think that it's definitely the case that there is that the positivist tradition is pretty well represented in the context of this particular instrument. That's true. One of the things that it's important to kind of understand about the instrument is that it's not a didactic instrument. It's not intended to teach. It's intended to provoke in some ways, right? So what we're really interested in doing is identifying statements that can be used to differentiate ranges of opinion about aspects of scientific research. And the initial group that put together the open-ended instrument that Christian mentioned is a group that actually had quite a number of post-positivist social scientists involved, and so who were very adamant about making sure that that particular perspective was as well represented as it could be. And you know, I'm not sure if we can say that we succeeded in striking a balance between the positivist perspective and a post-positivist perspective. But again, the point of the statements is primarily to get at the kinds of commitments on which there are a range of views. And the hope is that in talking about those statements, that range of views will emerge. And you know, so we don't see this as we don't see our job as teaching philosophy. So the goal of the group, if we've done our job correctly and well, the hope is that we will have done the philosophy in advance in a way that will be to some extent invisible to the participants, but it will nevertheless serve a structuring feature for the dialogue. So they'll be able to kind of walk into the dialogue, look at the instrument. The philosophy for the most part might be invisible to them, but the statements will nevertheless get at assumptions that they recognize, and then they'll have a dialogue about those assumptions. I mean, I think it's a legitimate criticism, and it's certainly a worry for the project if there's a tendency, a kind of on the part of the statements, to push a particular agenda. Certainly not the intention of the project to push an agenda. So if there's, and I'm not altogether certain I would buy that, but I recognize that as a concern.
I have a question that follows on from those comments up this way.
There you go. Sorry.
And it's, you know, as a tool, I think it was good because it provoked, as you said, it's designed to provoke and surface these assumptions, which I actually think with that team it did very well. But to do it in a more conscious way, why not use a task as the instrument and set the team the task of designing an instrument that would surface core assumptions that they felt would provoke this range of differences. So instead of having that as an invisible underlying aspect of the tool, make it up front, make it conscious, even set it as a task, and then you could set that amongst all the teams, and they would, you know, suggest this range of different tools that would do exactly what you're talking about, and it would be a conscious process that they're engaged in, they're designing and actually working together on a task to surface all those assumptions.
So describe again. So you're suggesting a different instrument, is that right?
Well,
go ahead.
to paraphrase, suggesting that the creation of the instrument is an activity that the group goes through,
right,
that they're able to come up with questions and scales that get at the assumption they want to address.
So yeah, introduce the whole task with all the way you have of introducing it, but as a conscious process rather as a hidden thing, you know, that then is debriefed.
For what it's worth, we are launching any day now a project that NSF will fund that focuses on integrating the development of toolbox type language into interdisciplinary environmental science curricula as a way of framing investigation of the values and policy dimensions of interdisciplinary science. And so the idea there, if Eric's paraphrase of your point is correct, the idea I think lines up with what you're suggesting, right? To have the philosophical work that the project engages in be a part of the process for those students in that class. The problem with this, I mean, so, you know, we're definitely all in favor of that. I guess what we've encountered is quite a bit of pushback in terms of time. Like when we first started this, we approached a number of groups around Idaho and got, we had a number of people say, you want 2 hours? I don't have 2 hours. It's like, but what about like in June? What about 6 months from now? Nope, I don't have 2 hours. I don't have 2 hours in June. I don't have 2 hours now, right? And so the idea of doing something that would require even more investment of time on the part of the collaborating scientists was an idea that we didn't even consider. So here what we want, oh, thank you. Okay, what we want to do is have the dialogue method be a really low-cost method in terms of the commitment on the part of the collaborating scientists. But we do acknowledge that the process itself is quite, or at least we think that the process itself of developing the language is quite illuminating. Thank you, and thank you again for your patience, everyone.